expanding his business, and he did it tremendously, organized it, and he killed with efficiency.
To understand Roy DeMeo, you have to look at his hands. They weren't the hands of a typical mobster, the kind that spent their days counting points on a sports book,
Mentor, and their boss.
or adjusting silk ties. Roy's hands were thick, calloused, and comfortable with the weight of steel. Before he was a feared soldier in the Gambino crime family.
Good watering hole. Wasn't a disco, was a very quiet bar where a man coming home from work could go in for a drink.
Roy was a butcher's apprentice in a local grocery store. He learned the grain of the meat, the location of the joints, and exactly how long it took for a body to cool. Most men see a corpse and see a tragedy or a crime. Roy DeMeo saw a logistical problem that required a sharp blade and a steady hand.
Roy got involved on the orders of Nino to help launder money.
In the mid-1970s, New York City was a place where bodies were found every day. They were in trunks, in the East River, or slumped in doorways. But Roy found this messy. To him, a body found was a failure. It was evidence. It was a lead for the police. Roy's ambition was to create a world where his enemies didn't just die. They evaporated. He didn't want to be a killer. He wanted to be an eraser. This is the story of how one man from Brooklyn industrialized death, lived a lie in the suburbs, and was eventually consumed by the very silence he worked so hard to create.
They knew exactly what kind of a car they had to steal.
Somebody would want a Jaguar.
If you were a target of Roy DeMeo, your disappearance was already a mathematical certainty before you even walked through the door of his headquarters. Roy had developed a professional, 7-step system for making people vanish. It was a process born of his time in the slaughterhouses, stripped of emotion and replaced with a terrifying rhythmic efficiency. This wasn't a hit in the traditional sense.
So Nino trusted his right-hand man, his top killer, Roy.
It was a manufacturing process where the final product was nothingness. The process always began with a phone call or a friendly wave. Roy understood that the hardest part of a murder was the struggle. If a man knows he is going to die, he fights, he screams, and he makes a mess. Roy avoided this by utilizing his natural charisma.
Any luxury car you need parts for eventually. So what they started to do then was to chop them up and sell the parts.
He would invite the victim to a meeting at a nondescript back room he controlled. He would offer a drink, a seat, and a sense of security. He wanted the victim's heart rate low. In Roy's world, a relaxed victim was a clean victim. The moment the victim's guard was down, the work began. Roy favored the point, .22 caliber pistol equipped with a silencer. He chose this specific caliber for a clinical reason. A .22 bullet is small and often lacks the power to exit the skull. It enters, ricochets around the brain cavity like a pinball, and causes instant death, but it leaves only a tiny entry wound. By keeping the bullet inside the head, Roy ensured there was no exit wound to spray blood across the room. It was the first step in his obsession with cleanliness. Immediately following the shot, while the body was still in the first few seconds of shock, Roy would step forward with a long, thin hunting knife. He would drive it directly into the victim's heart. This was the most critical part of the instructional. By puncturing the heart, Roy stopped the pump. If the heart isn't beating, the blood pressure drops to 0. This prevented the body from leaking during the next phases of the process. He treated the human circulatory system like a plumbing problem that needed to be shut off at the main valve.
Got pinched for narcotics.
As the heart was punctured, Roy or an associate would instantly wrap a thick, heavy towel around the victim's head. The goal was to catch the few drops of blood that might escape the entry wound. Roy couldn't afford a single drop to hit the floor. He had a pathological need for the environment to remain sterile. In his mind, if the room stayed clean, the crime never happened. The body was then carried into a bathroom and placed in the bathtub. Roy would leave it there for a specific amount of time, usually around 45 minutes. This allowed the remaining blood to settle and drain out through the controlled punctures. He would often use this time to have a cigarette or discuss business, waiting for the material to be ready for processing. By the time he returned to the tub, the body was relatively dry, which was essential for the next step. This is where Roy's butcher training became his most formidable tool. He would strip down to his undershirt, often wearing a plastic apron to protect his clothing. With the precision of a surgeon, he would take the body apart. He didn't use a saw to hack through bone.
If it's a store owner and he's killed, there's the outcry. But when an organized crime figure is killed, there is not that much outcry. There's not that much interest that the other detectives place. And I viewed this as a tremendous weakness.
He used a knife to find the joints. He would separate the arms at the sockets, the legs at the hips, and the head from the spine. By breaking the body down into its component parts, he made it unrecognizable and, more importantly, easy to package. The pieces were wrapped in heavy-duty plastic bags and placed into ordinary cardboard boxes, the kind you'd see in a grocery store or a moving van. These boxes were taped shut and driven to a massive municipal landfill. Roy knew that the sheer volume of New York City's trash was his best ally. The boxes were tossed into the fresh garbage, where they would be crushed by bulldozers and buried under tons of waste within the hour. No body, no crime, no ghost. But who was the man who could perform such acts?
Dump something there, you're not gonna find it ever, ever, ever. So that's what they used. They put them in heavy bags and dumped them off a boat out in the middle of the ocean.
If you saw Roy DeMeo on a Sunday afternoon, you wouldn't see a butcher. You would see a man who personified the American dream. This is the great irony of Roy's existence. The more efficient he became at destroying lives, the more dedicated he became to building a perfect one in the suburbs of Massapequa Park, Long Island. Roy lived in a beautiful home on a quiet street. He had a manicured lawn, a swimming pool, and a garage filled with luxury cars. To his neighbors, he was a successful businessman.
In the country is safe from the car thief. It affects everybody in the country.
It was a tremendous slew of warehouses found with skeletons of cars in them.
A guy who did something in cars or was involved in scrap metal. He was the neighbor who would help you jumpstart your car or offer you a cold beer over the fence. He was polite, well-spoken, and seemingly at peace. Inside the house, Roy was a legendary family man. He doted on his children and was fiercely protective of his wife. He attended every school function, every baseball game, and every holiday dinner. His son, Albert, would later describe a father who was warm, funny, and deeply affectionate. Roy kept the work entirely separate from the home.
Of the DA's office. He maintained all the organized crime files. He covers all the funerals. He covers all the weddings. And he writes his little notes, and he has folders upon folders of all the families.
There were no guns on the kitchen table. There were no late-night visits from scarred men in leather jackets. When Roy crossed the threshold of his suburban home, the butcher died, and the father was born. This ability to separate his two worlds was almost superhuman. Roy DeMeo wasn't just living a double life. He had perfected the art of mental compartmentalization. Psychologists who later studied similar mob figures often described this as a form of dissociative efficiency. Roy could dismember a body in a Brooklyn garage in the afternoon and still make it home in time for his daughter's piano recital in the evening without showing a single sign of stress. Neighbors in Massapequa Park remember him as the guy who organized block parties, coached Little League, and always had the best fireworks on the 4th of July. He seemed completely normal.
Fame them in their humanity forever.
People would be killed because they happened to accompany a target.
Perhaps even more stable and family-oriented than most fathers on the block. But behind the white picket fence, Roy's mind operated like a machine with two separate engines. One engine ran on violence, precision, and profit. The other ran on love, routine, and suburban respectability. He never mixed the fuel.
It's being made in the mob. You become an earner or you become a hitter, right? You kill somebody, you earn. Roy DeMeo was both.
Roy decided to expand the business into killing. Not just killing enemies, but now killing for the families. He'd take in any contract.
Associates who worked with him in the city said Roy rarely spoke about his family during work hours. Likewise, at home he almost never took phone calls after dinner. This strict boundary helped him maintain the illusion for years. His wife and children later said they had no idea about the full extent of his criminal life. To them, Dad was simply a hard-working man who provided a comfortable life. Roy's crew, the infamous DeMeo crew, operated out of a nondescript auto shop called Gemini Lounge in Brooklyn. This location became the central hub for his operation. From the outside, it looked like any other chop shop dealing in stolen cars. Inside, it housed one of the most efficient murder factories in American criminal history. Between 1975 and 1983, law enforcement estimates the crew was responsible for between 75 and 200 murders, though the real number may never be known. Roy didn't just kill rivals. He eliminated witnesses, business partners who became greedy, and even members of his own crew who showed signs of weakness. What made Roy truly terrifying was his business-like approach. He treated murder as a service industry. If a made man from another family needed someone removed quietly, they would come to Roy. For the right price, he would make the problem disappear, literally.
They would lure their victims to the place, and they would bring them in. They got done cutting the body up and draining the blood out of it in the bathtub. They all sat down with Roy DeMeo and they ordered a pizza, and they were eating the pizza with bloody hands. That's how despicable these people were.
This reputation gave him enormous power inside the Gambino family, but it also planted the seeds of his eventual downfall. As the body count climbed, so did the whispers. Other mobsters began to fear Roy more than they respected him. They worried that his efficiency made him unpredictable. One associate later told investigators Roy didn't kill because he was angry. He killed because it was Tuesday and the schedule said so. Roy's methods evolved over time. He began experimenting with different disposal techniques, depending on the season and police activity. In winter, he sometimes froze bodies in industrial freezers before dismembering them to reduce mess. In summer, he accelerated the draining process with ice and salt. He kept detailed mental logs of landfill schedules so his boxes would be buried as quickly as possible. This level of planning separated him from impulsive street killers. Roy wasn't emotional.
There was no need to do this. This was just, how would you say it, vicious evilness. I mean, mob heads normally aren't done that way. Why go to that length when they could just put a bullet in his head and dump him in the ocean?
He was an engineer of death. Yet, even the most meticulous machine develops cracks. By the late 1970s, Roy started showing subtle signs of strain. He became obsessed with cleanliness to the point of paranoia. He would scrub the Gemini Lounge floor for hours after every job. He insisted on burning all clothing worn during work. Some crew members said he began talking to himself while cutting up bodies, reciting grocery lists, or his children's school schedules, as a way to stay grounded. The duality that once protected him was slowly starting to erode his sanity. At the same time, Roy poured even more energy into his suburban image. He bought his children expensive gifts, took the family on vacations to Florida, and hosted elaborate backyard barbecues. He wanted his kids to grow up believing they were part of normal, successful America. In a cruel twist of fate, his son Albert would later say that his father taught him the value of hard work and loyalty.
To Florida, then it goes to a narcotics deal for $1 kilo, and they're going to be delivering it to New York. Up to New York to sell him the key. Him being the entrepreneur that he is, says, hey, I'm not going to pay them.
Lessons Roy learned on both sides of his life. The love Roy showed at home was genuine, which makes his double life even more disturbing. He wasn't faking affection. He truly believed he was a good father who happened to have a very dark job. This period of peak success in the late 1970s was also when Roy's crew reached its most feared status. They expanded into drug dealing, pornography, and large-scale car theft rings that generated millions. Roy used the profits to further insulate his family. He paid for private schools, swimming lessons, and family portraits. To outsiders, the DeMeo household looked like the American dream realized. Inside Roy's mind, Every dollar earned through blood was another brick in the wall that protected his children from the streets he came from. By the early 1980s, the engine began to fail. Roy DeMeo had become too successful, and in the world of the mafia, success brings its own kind of heat.
Roy found out this. He says, they're gonna send an army up here, and he says, they're gonna kill you. And they said, what name did you use? And he says, I went by Chris DeMeo. Roy says, my God, my family's dead.
The FBI began to look into the massive car theft ring Roy was running, and they started to notice the sheer number of people who went missing whenever they got close to Roy. But the law wasn't Roy's biggest problem. His biggest problem was his own family, the Gambinos. The leadership of the Gambino family was changing. Paul Castellano, the boss of bosses, wanted the mafia to look like a legitimate corporation. He hated the street elements, the blood, the noise, the mess. Roy DeMeo, despite his efficiency, had become a loud, vibrating liability. Roy was becoming paranoid. He began sleeping with an Uzi under his bed. He started threatening other made men.
He decides Chris has to go. They stare at Chris, he shoots Chris.
He was no longer a precision tool. He was a loose cannon with a 200 body count. Castellano realized that if Roy were ever arrested, he would have enough information to sink the entire Gambino family. He knew where the bodies were buried, literally. The decision was made. Roy DeMeo had to be erased, using the same silence he had mastered. But you couldn't send a stranger to kill Roy. He was too smart, too suspicious. You had to send his friends. In January 1983, Roy was called to a meeting. He likely knew the end was coming.
This has to be left, so it's going to make front page headlines. They parked him on Floyd Bennett Field, sat him in his car, put a 9mm between his legs, and the machine gun in the car.
He had grown erratic, his suburban facade crumbling under the weight of federal indictments and mob politics. He told his son he'd be back soon, but he left behind his watch and his ring, a sign that he knew he was walking into his own step one.
DeMeo men were very, very well respected. And this added power to Paulie. Nobody would make a move on Paulie. So that's how important Roy DeMeo was to.
The men who killed him were the men he had trained. They didn't use a 7-step system. They didn't have the stomach for it. They simply shot him multiple times in the head and chest. In a final, cruel irony, the man who spent his life making sure bodies were never found was stuffed into the trunk of his own Cadillac and left in a parking lot. When the police found Roy DeMeo, he was frozen.
An Electrolux salesman going around to the houses in Mississippi, comes up to his house to sell him a vacuum cleaner.
It was a cold New York winter, and the butcher was slumped in the trunk, a victim of the very violence he had turned into an art form. He died a man of two worlds, a monster to the city and a hero to his family. His legacy isn't one of power or respect, but of a terrifying silence. To this day, many of the boxes Roy tossed into those landfills have never been found. He achieved his goal of making people disappear, but in the end, he couldn't erase the one thing that mattered most, the truth of what he was. Roy DeMeo was a man who built a machine out of human lives, and when the machine finally broke, it took him with it. Thanks for watching. That's it, that's all. Barber Skinny. I'm out.